I think this is going to be the last session. In here, we're going to have a fireside chat. So, who is at the fire?
We are.
Oh, you're at the fire. Claire, come and take the hot seat.
Okay. French one in the middle.
The French one in the
Yes.
middle. A man sandwiched by beauty.
Yeah, exactly.
So while everyone is kind of like in and out, water, heat, and resilience.
Yes.
Yeah, we have the hot topic.
You have definitely the hot topic. Are you ready for the hot topic? Hello. Should I turn up the heat?
Yes. It's a good
Okay.
Or turn it down.
All right, go for it.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we are going to be discussing heat, water scarcity, flooding, how it's reshaping investment and becoming material financial risks from a macroeconomic perspective and from the perspective of services banks. So I started with heat is a hot topic. Today is really bringing it home. We are learning in real time what this means for basic infrastructure with which we run our lives and our businesses. And, frankly, for the 35 years that I've been working on climate, physical risk has been the poor cousin of the climate world. And now we're beginning to learn why we should have been focusing on it earlier. So I'm really delighted that we've got this half hour to cover perhaps the most important topic of the week. And we're going to do it in a very fast, very interesting format. So hold on to your seats. We're going to have 3 minutes per question. And we're going to move swiftly from a macroeconomic perspective down to realities on the ground, and then back up and down and back up and down. So beware. I don't think we're going to have time for questions because it is only half an hour. But we're all three of us going to mingle out there if you want to come and have a quick chat afterwards. So I've got Edouard Bonté from the Sustainable Portfolio Development Lead of Capgemini, and Ekaterina, I should have checked how I pronounce it, Gratcheva, Senior Advisor on Climate and Sustainable Finance with the IMF. And I'm Clare Shakya with the Nature Conservancy. So, Katya, we're going to start at macro level. Adaptation investment is often described as economically essential, and yet it remains significantly underfunded compared to mitigation. What have been the core challenges?
And I think today, especially who's in London, I think it's quite clear that adaptation and heat are essential now, and they're here to stay. And so it's a huge difference between, let's say, mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is something trying to deal with in the future with adaptation.
Do we need to speak up? You're struggling to hear.
You probably will need to speak up.
Or maybe we can move it here. This better? And adaptation is already here and now, and we can all feel it here. Adaptation is a relatively new concept in the financial industry, and maybe just to summarize it in a few statistics. Climate investment flows, whatever definition you use, and there are a number of different definitions on climate finance. Across all of these sets of definitions, more than 90% of those flows are for mitigation, and only just a fraction, single percentage points is for adaptation. And when you look at adaptation specific flows, more than 95% of those are, the way they're measured now, are funded by public capital. Very small percentage. It's like really single or double-digit billions are in the adaptation compared to increase in flows to the climate finance. So what is the challenge? Adaptation is much more complex than mitigation. Mitigation has clear metrics, it's carbon emissions, it's energy system where infrastructure is quite clear, projects are quite well defined. Adaptation is often in the eye of the beholder. And it's very context-specific, very localized. Something that is adaptation-specific in one context could be maladaptive in another context. And another thing that is created quite a lot of challenges is the this split into mitigation and adaptation, sort of like the two separate identities, created friction in decision makers on how to understand mitigation and adaptation. And sometimes mitigation and adaptation conflict with each other. Something that's become an adaptation could be contrary to mitigation, and in fact be negative on mitigation as well. So the trade-off becomes quite significant, and you would be sitting in a decision-making room, and rather than trying to figure out how to define adaptation investment, the discussion goes into, do we put it into this bucket or that bucket? And so it becomes sort of diverts attention. And maybe one last thing I will mention, until very recently, maybe until the current US administration, we also heard from the private sector resistance to go into adaptation because it was seen as greenwashing. Because if you invest in adaptation, that means you're not serious on mitigation, and that also was quite a deterrent into even consider that seriously.
Thank you, Katya. Okay, so Edouard, physical climate risk has been treated as a long-term scenario for some time. Why does it matter now for banks, investors, and infrastructure players?
Well, it's a good question, and I'll echo what you just mentioned also on the adaptation and mitigation. The key thing that we see at the bank level is that actually the physical climate risk, it's already a financial event. And we see this obviously for the clients of the bank because it's affecting the productivity, it's affecting the supply chain, it's then impacting the credit risk, the credit score, and the earnings and having an impact on the income statement of the bank. So to your point also about adaptation and mitigation, it's already there. And we see it with the banks across different regions. There's one thing that I think triggers a lot of interest now is the economic losses related to the natural disasters. And there is one trend that we see picking up within the banking sector. It's the fact that it's been quite underestimated for a long time because it's very indirect. It's when you think about physical risk, it's very systemic. Mm-hmm. So there are two numbers that are, I think, illustrating that quite well. The first one is the fact that last year, the direct impact, the economic losses related to natural disaster globally, it was roughly around $200 billion. That's coming from the United Nations. The thing is that the indirect impact is 10 times bigger. And we know that at some point, physical risk, heat, water stress, is impacting in a direct and indirect way the clients of the bank and the impact on the balance sheet of the banks as well. So we see upcoming attention, more and more attention span and investment on this topic across the bank because it's becoming a topic of performance, competitiveness, and quite an important topic and priority now.
Amazing, thank you. So, Katya, climate impacts alongside the challenging geopolitics that we're seeing today have affected climate investment flows. What are you seeing from your perspective?
I think one thing I would really like to emphasize, and I probably haven't heard as much in this whole, is the global north and global south divide. Because the realities is, especially in a case of adaptation, emerging markets are already suffering disproportionately, and they have contributed the least to carbon emissions. And on top of that, what we see now is global retrenchment of capital from risky jurisdictions that make it even more challenging for emerging markets to get access to finance at the time where their fiscal room and economic systems are already dealing with a number of shocks, energy shocks, geopolitical shocks. And that creates quite a different set of challenges, whether you're dealing with resilience and adaptation challenges from developed economies versus developing economies. And it would not be helpful to use the same set of tools and the same set of diagnostics on very different challenges. And as I mentioned earlier, adaptation is also so local and so heterogeneous, then it really requires bringing in a lot more complexity into decision making. And the financial sector more generally is actually not very good with dealing with complexity. So I think there is a number of different tension that we see. And it affects adaptation even much more than other types of climate investments.
Okay, so taking that issue
Yep.
and bringing it down to your level, Edouard, if climate risks are already material, why is the financial system still struggling to price them properly and translate them into lending, underwriting, and investment decisions?
But I would have maybe one word on that, the word that you just mentioned, complexity.
Yeah.
It's actually very much the case within the financial sector. So if we take somehow a step back, what we see is the fact that the financial system prices risks historically in silos, asset by asset, asset class by asset class, geos by geos, sector by sector. But when you look at physical risk, it's again systemic. If you think about the indirect impact of heat and water stress, it goes across very different domains in a way. So the financial system is not ignoring that, but they face, I would say, 3 challenges to price this quite well within their balance sheet. The first one is what we call the translation gap. It means the ability to connect climate science to decisions. This is sometimes very tough to do, and it's mainly the case because of a governance issue. That's the second thing we see. Why we are talking about governance? It's because, again, physical risk, it can be important and relevant for many different departments within the banks. But do they share the same view on their portfolio? Do they agree on the impact of physical risk? Are they able to assess the impact the same way within the same organization? Most of the time, it's not the case. So you have a translation gap issue, you have a governance issue, and a value framing issue, meaning, to your point about the value of adaptation, it's important, but yet we see discrepancies in the perception and to what extent it's on top of the banking priorities agenda. So that's what we clearly see, and the topic of complexity is quite important within the bank.
Okay. Complexity is not our friend, so... Katya, water scarcity and extreme heat don't respect asset class boundaries. They hit supply chains, they hit labour productivity, and they hit sovereign stability simultaneously. Is the financial system structurally capable of pricing something that's systemic and complex?
Yeah, we probably don't have enough time to get into the nuances to this, but let me connect this.
Please.
But maybe just to connect to 2 specific points from Edouard to answer this question. I think 2 things specifically stand out. Financial system and how it operates from the agent perspective, which is, as you said, they not only institutions which have very different sort of nature of how they operate and how they regulate it, but also within the institution, the credit committees, the investment committees, etc. The whole system is organized around investing in asset classes from the regulatory perspective, from investment decision making, etc. And you need to figure out how to bring in resilience into fixed income, into equity, into private markets. But adaptation doesn't work like that. It is a systemic issue, and so you become you're trying to square into a circle, or a circle into a square. Those are the things seem to be the most misaligned right now between the systemic issue, the sort of the financial system ecosystem, and what requires to actually have a very holistic view on adaptation investment. The second point I would pick up from you is translation issue even within the institution, within the different roles that makes up the whole of the investment decision. I actually want to elevate it into the macro level. What we found, there is, even though people use resilience and adaptation, but there is terminology and translation issues between the public sector and the private sector. You could be sitting in the same room, let's say, and you're trying to blend and de-risk using the public capital to de-risk some private sector capital. You think you're talking about the same issues, but then only when you look under the hood, you realize you've talked past each other. And I've seen multi-billion-dollar transactions fall through after quite an extended and intensive effort in setting something together for adaptation investments using both public capital and private capital, just to fall apart on some small technicalities, just because adaptation is seen as very different. And maybe one last point, and maybe that's what is also a deterrent investment. There is still a huge, from a private sector perspective, adaptation is still seen as a public sector good. And that is very hard to change. It's conceptual, and it's still a big elephant in the room.
Okay, I'm now wishing that well, let's see, if we have time at the end, I'd like to come back to what governments need to do in order to price it into the private investment world. But Edouard, many institutions now have climate scenarios, exposure maps, risk dashboards. We have a lot of tools. What does it take to turn those tools into real decisions on lending, pricing, underwriting, and capital allocation?
So it's the starting point is the right one, meaning we've had many progress over the past years. As I mentioned, the financial services sector is not ignoring the issue of physical risk. We've never had that much climate-related data and models. The key thing to fix the challenges we're facing today is actually just to break the silos and connect those climate science, climate data into the financial models of the banks, the data architectures of the banks. So in a way, connect the science with the business decisions of the bank. That's really something important, and that's also what we, I think, wanted to share within this panel, is to share the high-level macroeconomic trends, but also those very practical issues within organizations like banks that actually are slowing down the adaptation and mitigation. So one is clearly breaking the silos. Second is solving the operating model challenges within the organization, within the banks. Because to your point about sometimes discrepancies between public sector, private sector, it's actually the same within banks, within the organization. Sometimes the front line see the portfolio differently than the sustainability team, than the risk team. They don't look at it the same way with the same tool, the same dashboard, the same data. If you're able to fix that, breaking the silos, connect climate science to the decision, fix this operating challenge, for sure you'll get a lot of progress, and you will see the impact on the credit memo, on the discussion and investment committee and at board level. And there is one last thing I wanted to share. Most of the time when we have these discussions with banks and large institutions, you get skeptics in the room as well. And they always expect, the climate science to be absolutely perfect. If it's not perfect, then why using it? I'll always try to share that message. It's all about identifying vulnerabilities within the banks, trends. It's not about having the exact, precise number about the impact of a given water event or heat wave on your business. It's really identify the vulnerabilities, and most importantly, what business decision do you take out of that? How do you change your capital allocation? Do you have the right process and framework for that? So that's the kind of practical conversation we see in the industry, and most likely where the industry is going to in the next few years.
Super exciting, actually. Finally moving out of tools into,
Yes,
into the
to
real.
decisions.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. Okay, so we've done really well. Thank you both for such quick responses. We've actually still got a bit of time. So if you wouldn't mind just in a minute or two, just if you were talking to government policy setter, regulator, financial service regulator, what is it that would help you actually solve some of these issues? I realise that's put you on the spot a bit, but if you have something that's come to mind out of this conversation.
Do you want to?
I'll start. In fact, tomorrow, a lot of central banks are converging to Bank of England to have such a discussion. I'm representing IMF in that conversation. It's the global regulators, the country regulators and ministers of finance are now taking it very seriously and trying to tackle it. And the complexities actually really gets on the way of this issue. I think if I were to simplify it for what I've observed in different boardrooms and conversations, I think what actually gets on the way of dialogue is this bipolar approach to climate mitigation or adaptation. And I think it really does get in the way of finding the solution. I think quite often what frustrates me is rather than solving specific issues and designing solutions, we get trapped into some Bermuda Triangle of terminology and trying to label certain things in a certain way. And a lot of effort and a lot of intellect actually goes into something that is not entirely productive in this. I think we need to maybe think a little bit differently as to what we're trying to do with climate, and not to put it into neat buckets. That does really complicate things at the policy level.
Avoid the buckets and maybe to build on that. If there are like a couple of elements that I think could be useful for the audience, and to a point about even the executives within the financial sector, maybe I'd like to close on a more of a positive note, because most of what we need we already have today within the banks. If you think about it, the bank already are focusing very much on resilience, because they are asked by regulators to look at outcome resilience, assess the impact of compound shocks on their income statement, etc. Meaning they know already how to, conceptually speaking, look at different risks, even systemic risk. The only thing is, for physical risk, they need to strengthen the mechanism they have internally. And I would say do it not because the regulator is asking you to do it, but build some sort of an operating capability related to resilience. Meaning, again, it's not only the outcome resilience that it's important, but build some sort of a capability resilience. Build the engine to rerun scenarios, assess regularly the impact of physical risk, of different events, even beyond physical risk, geopolitical scenario, etc. Yeah. Play with that, use this tool, this scenario, to see how resilient you are. And that, on the positive side, will obviously accelerate the net zero journey, will for sure unlock many of the deals related to that, but also will align mainly with the business outcome and priorities of the bank. So I'm sure you can combine both agenda. If you build this capability resilience, make it an operating model, something they do on a day-to-day basis, and make sure that within the banks, people see this issue with the same lens, in a way.
Let me just maybe add
so
one sentence.
I'm going to give you both 2 minutes to close, so you can add your sentence into your closing. Katya.
No, but I think finishing on a positive note. When I say let's not make more buckets, it's actually a good problem to have. I've been in the finance industry for 3 decades, and we've never had it such a rich conversation about those issues. So it's actually it is. I've seen how when I started on the trading desk, when you mention the word sustainability, the dealer will roll their eyes. When now we actually are trying we are having those conversations and we're convergent to conversations. So in that sense, I'm quite optimistic. I think also the policy challenges are also making us think a little bit harder on the solutions. Yeah. I think we've had a good run of a decade since the Paris Agreement was signed. We can use that as a sort of an experiment of using different tools, disclosures, methods, methodologies. And I think right now the data is coming in to have a very honest conversation, what's working, what's not working, and move away from a maybe a little bit wishful thinking and naive decision making into much more grounded. So I think in a sense I'm certainly the technical teams that I'm working with, and even though I'm based in Washington, I'm actually thinking we working even harder now because the bar is higher. How do we prove the impact? How do we make things happen? So I think in that sense I'm quite optimistic.
And same honestly. And the more I'm into it, even though I'm based in New York and connecting with many US-based organizations, sometimes you can become a little bit skeptic, especially over the past years. But I think being optimistic is important. But the more I'm into it, the more I realize that those challenges are not impossible to solve. Mm-hmm. And they are going back to certain challenges we've been solving already for years, breaking silos, providing the right data and models for better business decisions. Those things, we've been able to achieve already in the past on other topics. And there is no way climate could not be one of this topic. So simple things, breaking silos, building capability resilience, and make all this intelligence good for business decisions.
Excellent. And I guess, I mean, just sort of bringing that together a little bit, thinking about that sort of macro to the sort of operations, the day-to-day financial decision-making. This idea of sort of, it is complex. We are dealing with much greater complexity, but I loved that you were pulling out that actually we do that all the time. Yeah. We're dealing with geopolitical changes that are complex, and we're having to make real-time decisions all the same. So this is not outside the ability.
Exactly.
And building that operational capability, I think, is really essential. And we're beginning to see the central banks, the ministers of finance, no longer being a coalition of the most far-sighted, the most prepared to think about these things, but actually it's becoming something that everyone is having to focus their minds on. But it is about building a new language at times and building a new comfort level with these and a way of understanding those systemic risks in ways that we can understand the implications in different ways. So running the scenarios I liked as well. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thanks for your insights.
I actually have bought us a few more minutes because you started by saying in terms of what is it with governments in terms of adaptation. And many years ago in Doha, was any of you in Doha for the COP? There was a wise man saying, you're all going to have a lot of mitigation and adaptation and not so much fun, depending on when do you start that. So I guess in terms of the governments, love to hear about that. And then, how far are we in the mitigation, adaptation? How much are we going to suffer or have fun?
You're giving us more time, are you?
I'm giving you now 5 more minutes.
5 more minutes, excellent. Look at that. Goodness.
I think maybe I can start if you want. But when I think about how far are we, I think a lot has been done already. At least again from my perspective within the banking industry, a lot has been done, and the adoption is there. And even when we work with some of the banks, we see now they have the proper framework in place. They have selected the right physical risk data provider. They start to embed that into the operations. Hopefully, that's going to accelerate even more. Conscious of two things. One is the paradox of time, because, for example, lending portfolio are renewed quite often within the banks. So if you start thinking about the impact on your clients in 2050, that's not a question that the bank is actually considering, because their lending portfolio will be completely new in 5 years anyway. So you have to somehow deal with that paradox, and also the paradox that if I do great things, but if you don't, then it's a collective effort, and you need to embark everyone. So we still face those paradoxes that still, I think, slow down the lack of slow down the pace of transformation. That being said, again, to remain on a positive note, the foundation is there. And sometimes when I said earlier, break the silos, to me this is one of the most bullshit sentence I've heard in consulting for years. But it's coming from clients, from banks, who are actually telling me my issue today is breaking the silos internally in order to connect climate science to decisions. And I'm thinking like, wow, we've heard that for years. That's something we know we can do it. And we've done it in the past in other domains. So foundation is there, and I'm sure it will accelerate thanks to that.
Maybe just switching gears a little bit. I was just trying to figure out how to answer your question, because it's such an open framed. I, as a day-to-day job in finance and policy circle, at some point I gotten so frustrated in the last year and a half of sitting in Washington and looking at it. I started to work with a technical team outside of finance sector just to look at the different technology transformation and technology transitions over the last 200 years, whether that's railways or telecoms or other types of technology. And they all have very similar S-curves. And then we were trying to figure out how much finance matters, how much policy matters. And it's almost like if you put it within that like 200-year horizon, S-curves come. And I think we're just at the beginning of the S-curves. And then at some point it becomes exponential. And that gave me a lot of hope. So all of those little decisions that we do actually do it up. And at some point the change becomes marginally much faster, and that's exactly what we see in some of the technologies, wind and storage and others that are starting to add up.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll come back because you mentioned compound risk earlier, and that's been sitting with me because I think one of the issues that we have that isn't the S-curve is the rate of change. It's with the compounding risks combined with tipping points and seeing these exponential shifts, and then the cascading risks. All slightly different in terms of how you have to think about them to deal with them. And I think the point about these are quite often collective, and this is what I think the regulators, policymakers have to do, is assign responsibility. Otherwise, we never get beyond that. We have to be, the UK's biodiversity net gain has required property developers to find a way of investing back in nature. And that's actually the other silo that, as you were both talking about adaptation, I was thinking, there's adaptation, there is transition risk, there's the carbon, there's also nature. They're all three of them interacting. And there is a difference between what we have to do to construct a new world and what we have to do to deconstruct the old world. And it's often the governments are finding it much easier to construct a new world and hope that becomes the majority world than to start to help people move out of the old world. So we need to be looking at how we support the private sector to be tackling these things as well. And
just to build on that, we've seen the same pattern across other topics, like the adoption of technology. Sometimes in emerging countries, they go faster in adopting new technologies because they don't have the legacy to manage. Exactly. They don't have to deconstruct a lot. Yeah. So hopefully that's the kind of pattern we'll see.
Seeing the leapfrogging,
exactly.
See, now one of the other panels, how many were here when we talked about boiling frogs? Now we're talking about leapfrogging.
You see, it's there.
Please help me give our fireside chat, water, heat, and resilience. I will now give you all 15 minutes of break, and then we'll continue not in here, but in A, and then afterwards there's drinks.